There is a moment, deep in the wilderness, when the world goes quiet in a way that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels like a warning. The birds stop, the wind drops, and something that was distant is suddenly very, very close. For one hiker on a remote trail in the mountains of the American Northwest, that moment came without any warning at all. One wrong turn, one missed marker, and then, from somewhere behind the tree line, a sound, low, rhythmic, heavy, the unmistakable sound of something breathing that is not human. If you want to know what happens next, stay right here. And if you're new to this kind of storytelling, hit subscribe right now, because every single week we go deep into the moments where nature reminds us exactly who is in charge. This is the story of Marcus Webb, a 34-year-old environmental consultant from Portland, Oregon. A man who had hiked over 200 trails in his lifetime. A man who knew the difference between a bear print and a deer track. Who carried bear spray. Who had read every guide, every pamphlet, every piece of advice ever written about backcountry hiking in bear country. A man who, on a Tuesday morning in late September, walked confidently past a fork in the trail and chose the wrong path without ever realizing he had made a choice at all. The mountains of the Pacific Northwest are not like other wilderness. They are ancient, in a way that feels almost aggressive. The trees are enormous. The silence between them is thick and textured, filled with the drip of moisture from bark and the occasional distant percussion of a woodpecker working deep in the canopy. The undergrowth is dense and low, sword ferns pushing up through the soft duff of the forest floor, huckleberry bushes tangled along the trail edges, their late-season berries dark and swollen and fragrant. That fragrance matters. It will matter very much before this story is over. Marcus had planned a straightforward 15-mile loop in the Cascades, a trail he had done twice before, the last time 3 years earlier. He had downloaded a map to his phone, checked the weather, packed appropriately. He had driven up the evening before and slept in his truck at the trailhead, wanting an early start to catch the morning light. At 5:45 in the morning, with a headlamp strapped to his forehead and his breath making small white clouds in the cold air, he started walking. The first hour is always the best hour on any hike. The body is fresh, the mind is quiet, the world is waking up in increments, the darkness softening from black to gray to that particular deep blue that comes just before the sun clears the ridgeline. Marcus had his poles in his hands and his pack settled comfortably on his shoulders, and he was moving at a good pace, maybe 3 miles an hour on the flat sections, slower as the trail began to climb toward the first ridge. He noticed the fork at approximately mile 4, just past a creek crossing. He would tell this part of the story later with a kind of rueful disbelief. The fork was obvious. There was even a post, though the sign itself had been knocked sideways by a fallen branch and was pointing at roughly 45 degrees off from its intended direction. Marcus barely glanced at it. He took the left branch because the left branch looked more worn, more traveled, more like a main trail. It was not the trail he was supposed to be on. The trail he was supposed to be on went right, across a narrow log bridge over the creek, and continued up a well-maintained switchback toward the ridge. The left branch went somewhere else entirely. For the first mile or so, the left branch felt perfectly normal. It was a real trail. It had been used, perhaps heavily used at some point in the past. It was just not maintained anymore. Marcus noticed the first sign that something was off when the trail began to narrow. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, the way a stream gets shallower as you walk it toward its source. The edges crept in. The fern fronds began to brush his legs. The path underfoot became less distinct, the packed earth giving way to soft soil where boots had not been pressing regularly for some time. He stopped and checked his phone. This is where the first real problem revealed itself. He had downloaded the map the night before, sitting in the parking lot of a gas station where he'd stopped for coffee and snacks, and he had downloaded it over a cellular connection that turned out to be weak enough that the download had not completed properly. The map loaded on his screen as a pale gray rectangle with a single blue dot indicating his position. That was all. No trail lines, no contours, no landmarks. Just him, a blue dot in a gray rectangle. He checked for signal. 1 bar, then none. He held the phone up, moved it around, walked back 20 feet toward the fork. Still nothing. He was not panicking. Marcus was, by temperament and by training, not a person who panicked easily. He was analytical. He thought in steps. Step 1 was to assess what he actually knew. He knew his general direction. He knew he had started heading north-northeast from the trailhead. He knew the loop he had planned would eventually bring him back around in a broad arc to the south. He knew the primary ridge was to his north, and he knew that if he could reach it, he could orient himself. He decided to continue. This is a decision that will later seem, with the perfect clarity of hindsight, like the precise moment everything changed. But hindsight is not available to anyone in the moment, and the moment Marcus was in felt manageable. The trail was still there, faintly, and the morning was clear, and he was experienced, and he had food and water for 2 full days, and he had a compass on the back of his watch. He walked on. The forest changed as he went deeper. This is something that hikers sometimes talk about but rarely understand until they experience it, the way the interior of a forest has its own personality, distinct from its edges. The trees grew larger here, older, further from any road or clearing. Douglas firs with trunks 4 and 5 feet across. Western red cedars draped in moss so thick and green it looked almost luminous in the low morning light, filtering down from 60, 70 feet above. The undergrowth was denser, the huckleberry bushes were everywhere, and they were absolutely loaded with fruit. Late season, past peak, the berries were heavy and dark and the smell of them was extraordinary, a sweet fermented richness that saturated the air. Marcus ate a handful as he walked. They were excellent, he noted, with the part of his brain that was always taking inventory, that there was an enormous amount of food here for any animal that wanted it. He thought briefly about bears. He thought about how bears spend the weeks before hibernation in a state called hyperphagia, during which they eat almost continuously, consuming up to 20,000 calories per day as they build the fat reserves that will carry them through the winter. He thought about how a berry patch this rich would be exactly the kind of place a bear would spend its mornings. He thought about all of this in the abstract, academic way that a person thinks about things that feel distant and theoretical. Then he heard it. He was perhaps 7 miles into his total hike at this point, and the trail had essentially dissolved. He was following a crease in the topography, a shallow depression that might have been a drainage or might have been the ghost of a path, and he had just pushed through a particularly dense stand of young alders when the sound reached him. He stopped immediately. The way you stop when your body understands something before your brain catches up. Breathing. Heavy, rhythmic breathing. From somewhere in the trees to his left, maybe 30 feet away, maybe less. The trees were thick enough that he could not see more than 20 feet in any direction. The sound was low and slow, each exhalation a long, deliberate release, and between the exhalations a wet, snuffling sound, like something working its nose through vegetation. Marcus did not move. His hand went to the bear spray on his hip. Not drawing it, just touching it, confirming its presence, the way you might touch a wall in the dark to confirm the room is real. His heart was running fast now, but his feet were absolutely still. The breathing continued. Whatever was making it had not detected him yet. The wind, he realized, was in his favor, coming from the northwest, from whatever was behind those trees toward him rather than away. That was luck. Raw, blind luck. He stood there for what felt like several minutes, and was probably 30 seconds. The breathing did not stop. It did not get closer. It was the breathing of something large, something completely at ease in this place, something that had no idea it had company. Then a branch cracked. Not close, maybe 50 feet away, in a different direction, to his right, and the breathing stopped. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Marcus had ever experienced. He gripped the bear spray. He remembered the advice he had read, had absorbed so thoroughly that it was almost physical knowledge rather than intellectual. Make yourself known before an encounter, not during. Talk, be loud, announce yourself so the bear knows you're human and not a threat. Surprise encounters are dangerous encounters. A bear that hears you coming has time to leave. A bear that doesn't is a bear that feels cornered. He had not been talking. He had been moving silently through a berry patch in prime bear country in September, in near silence, alone. He had done almost everything wrong. Very slowly, very deliberately, he began to speak, not loudly at first. A low, steady voice. Hey, bear. Hey there. Just a person. Coming through. Hey, bear. Nothing moved. The forest held its breath. He took one step backward, then another. He was moving away from the direction of the breathing, keeping himself turned slightly sideways so he could see to his left while he backed away, his eyes scanning the dark spaces between the tree trunks. Then he saw it. Not the whole animal. Just a shape. A massive dark shape, moving slowly through the undergrowth parallel to where he stood, heading roughly northward through the huckleberry. It was not running. It was not charging. It was moving the way a large, confident animal moves when it is comfortable in its environment, and simply relocating from one feeding spot to another. But it was large. Even partially obscured by brush and shadow, the sheer bulk of the animal was unmistakable. This was not a small bear. This was a mature adult, and based on its size and the width of its shoulders and the way it moved, Marcus's immediate instinct was that it was a grizzly. The shoulder hump, the dish-shaped face, briefly visible as the animal turned its head in his direction. Grizzly bears in the Cascades. Some people would tell you they're not there. Some studies say the population is small, relic, barely present. The people who work the backcountry know differently. They're there. They've always been there. You just have to go far enough off the trail to find them. Marcus was very far off the trail. The bear turned its head again, and this time it stopped moving. It was looking directly at him, or rather looking at his general direction, because bears do not see especially well at a distance. But it was smelling him. Even with the wind in his favor, even at this distance, a grizzly bear's nose is one of the most powerful sensory instruments in the natural world, capable of detecting scent from miles away, of reading the chemical complexity of the air the way we read text, in layers and meanings and detailed narratives. It was building a picture of him from molecules. He kept talking, low and steady. "Hey bear, I'm just a person, not a threat, just passing through. Hey now." The bear stood still for what seemed like a very long time. Then it exhaled. A huge, slow exhalation, a sound like something deflating, and it turned away and continued moving northward through the brush. Marcus did not move for a full 5 minutes after the bear disappeared from his sight. He counted the time on his watch. He stood there with his bear spray in his hand and his heart slamming against his ribs and the forest absolutely silent around him, and he counted the seconds. When 5 minutes had passed, he began moving south. He had a compass. He had daylight, though the forest canopy kept it dim. He had enough water and food. And he had, against what felt like improbable odds, just experienced a close encounter with one of North America's apex predators and come out of it intact. He was shaking, and he knew he was shaking, and he decided to let himself shake, because trying to suppress it would take energy he needed for other things. The walk back out took him 4.5 hours. The trail he had been on dissolved entirely after another half-mile, and he was navigating by compass bearing and terrain reading and instinct, working his way down through drainages and across ridges, following the sound of water when he heard it, because water runs downhill, and downhill was where he needed to go. He crossed 2 streams he didn't recognize, he pushed through undergrowth that hadn't been touched by human hands in years, and he moved the entire time with his bear spray in his hand, talking out loud, a continuous low monologue, marking his presence in the forest with sound. He found the main trail by accident, almost literally stumbling onto it when a barely visible flagging tape caught his eye, old orange plastic wrapped around a tree at head height, the kind of marker a trail crew puts up and then forgets about. He followed the flags, and the flags led him to the trail, and the trail led him out. He reached the trailhead parking lot at 4:17 in the afternoon. His truck was the only vehicle there. He sat in the driver's seat for a long time before he started the engine. Now, here is what Marcus's story opens up, because it is not simply a story about one person who made one wrong turn and got lucky. It is an entry point into something much larger, something that has been unfolding in the wilderness of the American West for decades, something that involves bears and humans and habitat and the complicated, shifting boundary between the world we've built and the world that was here before us. Grizzly bears once ranged across most of North America, from Alaska down through the Rocky Mountains and the Cascades, across the Great Plains into Mexico. Early estimates suggest there may have been 50,000 grizzlies in the lower 48 states when European settlers first arrived. By 1975, when the grizzly bear was listed as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act, that number had collapsed to somewhere between 700 and 1,000 animals, confined primarily to isolated pockets in Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, and a few bears in the North Cascades. What happened to them is a story about almost everything that happens when humans and large predators share a landscape. There was hunting, relentless and largely unregulated for more than a century. There was habitat loss, as forests were cleared and grasslands plowed and river corridors drained and developed. There was direct persecution, because ranchers lost livestock and homesteaders felt threatened, and bears were killed for being bears in the places where bears had always lived. And there was fragmentation, the way human infrastructure cuts wild landscapes into islands too small and too isolated for wide-ranging animals to move between them. The grizzly's decline was not an accident. It was the cumulative consequence of 1,000 individual decisions, most of them made without any awareness of what they were adding up to. Recovery has been slow and politically contentious. The Greater Yellowstone ecosystem population, the most intensively managed and studied group of grizzlies in the lower 48, has grown from roughly 150 animals in the 1970s to somewhere around 700 today. This is an extraordinary conservation success story, and it is simultaneously a source of intense conflict, because 700 bears in an ecosystem that is also home to ranches and farms and small towns and tourist infrastructure is not a simple situation. Bears need to eat. They need enormous amounts of food, particularly in the weeks before denning, and what they eat shifts with the seasons and with the availability of resources. For decades, one of the most important foods for Yellowstone grizzlies was the whitebark pine nut, a high-fat, high-calorie food source found at high elevations and gathered by the bears from the caches of Clark's nutcrackers, birds that harvest and store the nuts by the thousands. Whitebark pines are in catastrophic decline across their range, devastated by a fungal disease called white pine blister rust and by mountain pine beetle outbreaks that have been dramatically worsened by changing temperatures at high elevations. As whitebark pine nuts have become scarcer, bears have been forced to move to lower elevations to find food. Lower elevations where people live, where livestock graze, where orchards grow, and garbage cans sit, and beehives stand unprotected. This is not a story with a villain. It is a story about what happens when the natural systems that large predators depend on are disrupted, and how the consequences ripple outward in directions that no one fully predicted. In the North Cascades, where Marcus encountered his bear, the grizzly situation is even more uncertain. The North Cascades grizzly population is thought to be extremely small, possibly only a handful of individuals, possibly fewer. There is active debate among wildlife managers and conservation organizations about whether a formal recovery effort should be undertaken, whether bears should be translocated from other populations to bolster the Cascades group. The debate involves biologists and ranchers and tribal nations and recreationalists and politicians, and it is nowhere near resolution. What is not in debate is the ecological importance of grizzly bears in the landscapes they inhabit. They are what ecologists call a keystone species, meaning their presence and behavior shapes the ecosystem around them in ways that extend far beyond their direct physical impact. Bears are tremendous seed dispersers. They consume enormous quantities of berries and deposit the seeds in their scat across huge areas, supporting plant regeneration across the landscape. When they feed on salmon in rivers, dragging carcasses up into the forest, they transfer marine nutrients into the terrestrial ecosystem, enriching soils and supporting plant communities that are measurably different in areas where bears feed than in areas where they do not. The nitrogen from salmon carcasses moves up into the trees, into the moss, into the insects, into the birds. A forest with bears fishing in its streams is a more complex, more productive, more diverse forest than one without. When you remove a keystone species, the arch doesn't just weaken, it collapses, the whole structure changes. Marcus knew all of this in the abstract, academic way that people know things they haven't yet felt in their body. After his afternoon in the Cascades, he knew it differently. He went back to that trail a month later. He went back with a guide, a woman named Patricia Solis, who had spent 15 years working with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and who had handled more bear encounters than she could count. He wanted to understand what had happened, not just to process it emotionally, though that was part of it, but to actually understand the mechanics of the encounter, what he had done right, what he had done wrong, what the bear had been doing, and why it had behaved the way it did. Patricia walked with him back to the fork where he had taken the wrong turn, and then along the narrowing path to the point where he had heard the breathing. She moved through the forest differently than most people do, reading it the way a person reads a room, noting every detail, the freshly turned soil where something had been digging, the bent and stripped stems of huckleberry bushes, the tracks in the soft mud along the drainage edge. She found the tracks almost immediately, round, wide, with 5 toes and long claw marks extending out ahead of them, the claw marks of a grizzly extending much further forward relative to the toe pads than those of a black bear. The prints were large. She measured one with her hand, spanning it palm to fingertip. "About 10 inches, she said. "Big animal. Probably a male. Maybe 400 pounds, maybe more." She followed the tracks for a while, reading the story they told. The bear had been here for some time. Hours, she estimated, based on the density of the feeding sign in the berry bushes. It had been moving slowly through the patch, methodically stripping berries from branches, pausing to dig for roots in a couple of places, working its way north along the drainage. "He was never hunting you," she told Marcus. "He didn't know you were there. You were in his breakfast spot at breakfast time, and you surprised him, and he chose to leave. That's what most bears do. They choose to leave. But sometimes they don't," he said. "No," she said. "Sometimes they don't." There is a particular kind of bear encounter that wildlife managers worry about more than any other. It is not the chance meeting in a berry patch, the mutual surprise that Marcus experienced, the encounter that resolves when both parties recognize each other as non-threatening and separate. It is the encounter that happens when a bear has learned to associate humans with food, when a bear has gotten into a campsite's food store, or found a trail runner's dropped protein bar, or been fed by a well-meaning but catastrophically misguided hiker. A bear that has learned that humans mean food is a bear that loses its appropriate wariness, that begins to approach people rather than avoiding them, that closes the distance instead of opening it. These are what managers call food-conditioned bears, and the sad truth about food-conditioned bears is that they almost always end up dead. Because a bear that approaches humans is a bear that someone will eventually perceive as a threat, or that will take food from someone in a way that escalates, and the resolution, almost invariably, is the destruction of the bear. A fed bear is a dead bear. This is not a slogan. It is a documented, measurable reality, repeated in bear populations across North America with heartbreaking regularity. The rules that have evolved around food storage in bear country, the bear canisters and the bear boxes, and the requirements about hanging food, and the prohibitions against cooking near your tent, they are not bureaucratic inconveniences. They are the front line of a system designed to prevent exactly this kind of tragedy. They protect humans, yes, but they also protect bears. The two things are not in opposition. Marcus had done everything right with his food. His pack had a proper bear canister. He had not eaten anything near where he slept the night before. He had his bear spray. His failure was simpler and more fundamental. He had not paid sufficient attention to where he was going. He had not treated the terrain as something that required his full respect. This is the thing that the backcountry will eventually teach every person who spends enough time in it. It is not your classroom. It is not your gym. It is not a park designed for your recreation. It is a working ecosystem with its own logic and its own priorities and its own inhabitants. And when you enter it, you are a guest in someone else's home. The manners required are not the manners of the city or the suburb. They are older than that. They are the manners of a species that spent most of its evolutionary history not at the top of the food chain, and that forgot this fact somewhere in the last few thousand years and has been paying periodic, unexpected tuition ever since. Patricia Solis told Marcus something on that return visit that stayed with him. She had been called out more times than she could remember to deal with bears that had come into conflict with humans, and in the vast majority of cases, when she reconstructed what had happened, the conflict had been preventable. Not always by the human. Sometimes the circumstances were genuinely unpredictable, but usually, there was a moment where a different decision would have changed the outcome. "The bears are not the problem," she said. "They are doing exactly what bears have always done in this landscape. We came into their neighborhood and built our houses and planted our orchards and left our garbage out, and then we were surprised when they showed up at the table we had set for them. The problem is us not understanding the place we're in." She said this without anger, more with the tone of someone who has spent a very long time trying to explain something obvious to people who want a simpler answer. The simple answer is always something like, "The bears are dangerous and need to be controlled." The real answer is always more complicated and requires more from us. Bear spray is worth discussing at length, because there is still a startling amount of confusion and skepticism about it among people who spend time outdoors. The research on this is clear. Bear spray, when used correctly, is more effective than firearms in preventing bear attack injuries. A study published in the Journal of Wildlife Management analyzed bear spray incidents and found it effective in stopping aggressive behavior in over 90% of cases. The same researchers found that firearms were effective in significantly fewer cases, partly because shooting an attacking bear requires accuracy under extreme stress, and partly because a wounded bear may continue its attack while a bear hit with pepper spray typically breaks off and retreats. Bear spray works by causing immediate intense irritation to the mucous membranes of the eyes, nose, and respiratory system. It does not cause permanent harm to the bear. It is not a lethal deterrent. It is designed to interrupt an attack and allow the person to retreat. It needs to be deployed before the bear is within 10 to 15 feet, which means it needs to come off your hip fast, which means it needs to be on your hip and not buried in your pack. Marcus had it on his hip. That was right. What you do in a bear encounter depends entirely on what kind of encounter it is. A surprised bear, like the one Marcus encountered, is generally best managed by giving it space, speaking calmly, avoiding direct eye contact, and backing away slowly. Running is almost universally the worst option. Running triggers pursuit responses in predators. Bears can run at 30 miles per hour. You cannot. A predatory attack, a bear that is stalking you or approaching you with focused, deliberate attention, and without the signs of stress that accompany a defensive encounter, bluff charges, popping jaws, huffing, laid-back ears, is a different situation entirely. A predatory attack should be fought back against, actively and aggressively, because submitting does not de-escalate a predatory encounter. A defensive attack, the surprised or provoked bear that makes contact, should generally be survived by playing dead, covering your neck with your hands, lying face down, and remaining as still as possible until the bear is convinced you are no longer a threat. The distinction matters enormously, and in the moment it is not always easy to make. This is why spending time in bear country requires not just carrying the right equipment, but understanding the behavioral language of the animal you might encounter. Grizzly bears and black bears, the two species you're most likely to encounter in the American backcountry, are different animals with different temperaments and different contexts for aggression, and the rules for one do not automatically apply to the other. Black bears are more likely to be deterred by assertive behavior. Grizzlies, particularly in defensive encounters, require a different approach. This is not academic. This is the kind of knowledge that can determine whether a bad encounter ends with both parties walking away or whether it ends much worse. Spending time in bear country is a choice, and it is a choice that requires preparation. Not paranoia, not fear. Preparation, and something rarer than preparation. Humility. The willingness to enter a landscape on its terms rather than your own. Marcus Webb spent the following spring taking a wilderness first aid course. He upgraded his navigation equipment, carrying a dedicated GPS device in addition to his phone and the compass on his watch. He started hiking with a group on technical backcountry routes, people who had more experience than he did, and from whom he was consciously trying to learn. And he joined a volunteer trail maintenance crew, spending several weekends helping to clear and re-sign the very trail system where he had gotten lost, restoring the marker at the fork where he had taken the wrong path. He did it, he said, because he wanted to make the mistake he had made less possible for the next person, but also because he wanted to spend more time in that forest, because his fear, which had been real and sharp and physical in those moments behind the alder stand, had resolved into something else entirely, something closer to reverence. He had seen a grizzly bear living its life in one of the last wild places where grizzly bears can still live their lives. He had stood 30 feet from one of North America's most magnificent animals, and the animal had tolerated his presence and moved on and left him standing in the huckleberry in the cold morning air of the Cascades. Most people will never experience that. Most people live their entire lives without ever feeling the particular, irreplaceable quality of being genuinely small in a genuinely large place, without ever standing in a forest old enough to make human history feel recent, among animals that are not impressed by us, that do not organize their existence around our comfort or our schedule or our sense of our own importance. There is something in that experience, something essential and clarifying, that is becoming harder to access as the wild places shrink and the managed, curated, sanitized versions of nature expand. The trails that are paved and lit and equipped with handrails and interpretive signs at regular intervals, these are good things, genuinely good things. They bring people to nature who would otherwise have no access to it at all, but they are not the same as the other thing. The thing that Marcus found by accident when he took the wrong turn at that broken signpost and walked into an unmaintained drainage in the Cascades and heard an animal breathing in the trees. The wild places need champions. They need the people who have felt what Marcus felt to use that experience, to turn it into advocacy and attention and political will, because the wild places are not capable of arguing for themselves in the forums where their fate is decided. They need us to argue for them, and that requires knowing them. And knowing them requires going in. This brings us back to bears, because bears are, in many ways, the most legible expression of wilderness health. Where grizzlies live in self-sustaining numbers, the ecosystem is large enough and intact enough and complex enough to support them. Their presence is a signal, like a biological indicator species, telling us something essential about the condition of the land. Their absence tells us something too, and what it tells us is not reassuring. The recovery efforts underway in the Greater Yellowstone and Northern Continental Divide ecosystems are genuine successes. They are hard-won and fragile and politically contested every step of the way, but they are real. There are more grizzly bears in Montana today than there were 50 years ago. That is an extraordinary thing. It did not happen by accident. It happened because people decided it mattered and worked toward it across decades and in the face of sustained opposition. The question of whether grizzlies will recover in the North Cascades, whether there will ever again be a self-sustaining population of them in the range where Marcus had his encounter, is genuinely open. The habitat is there. The corridor connections are problematic but potentially improvable. The prey base exists. The argument against recovery is primarily about conflict potential, about livestock losses and human safety, and the political complexity of managing a large predator in a landscape that has significant agricultural and ranching interests. These arguments are real. The concerns of ranchers and farmers who lose livestock to bears are real. The solutions being tried: compensation programs for verified livestock losses, non-lethal deterrent systems, range riders, livestock guardian dogs, electric fencing around beehives and orchards, are imperfect but improving. They represent an attempt to make coexistence economically viable for the people who bear its costs most directly. Because coexistence that is paid for entirely by one group of stakeholders is not sustainable. The costs and the benefits need to be distributed more fairly. In the places where this has been done most thoughtfully, where the economic interests of the people living alongside large predators have been genuinely considered and addressed, the results are measurably better. The bears stay wild. The livestock losses are reduced. The conflict is lower. The political will to sustain protection is stronger. It is not a simple problem. It was never going to be a simple problem. But the fact that it is complex does not mean it is insoluble. Patricia Solis told Marcus, on that follow-up visit, that she had been doing this work for 15 years, and she had never lost her wonder at the animals she worked with. Every time she saw a grizzly bear, she said, every single time, she felt the same thing. A kind of disbelief that something this wild, this complete, this utterly indifferent to human opinion still existed in the world, that she got to live in a time when it still existed. We should all, she said, be so lucky. The huckleberry bushes in the drainage where Marcus had his encounter are bare now, as winter comes on. The berries are gone. The bear that was breathing in the trees that morning in September is, by now, denned somewhere on a north-facing slope, in a hollow under a root mass or deep in a deadfall, its heart rate dropped to a fraction of its active pace, its body burning through the fat reserves it spent the autumn accumulating. It will emerge in the spring, lean and hungry and disoriented, into a world that has been blanketed and then uncovered by snow, and it will begin again the ancient, continuous work of being a grizzly bear in the mountains. Marcus will be back out there too. He's already planning a route for early May, when the snowpack has settled enough to make the high country passable. He'll carry bear spray on his hip. He'll have a proper map downloaded on a device that doesn't depend on cell service. He'll make noise as he walks. He'll tell someone exactly where he's going and when to expect him back. And he'll take the right trail, probably. But if he hears something breathing behind the trees, he'll know what to do. He'll stand still. He'll speak in a low, calm voice. He'll give the animal space and time to understand what he is. And then, carefully, slowly, he'll back away. Because the forest is not his. He is just a visitor. And the best visitors know how to behave in someone else's home. There is something else that Marcus said, in one of the conversations that informed this story, something that stuck in the way that simple things sometimes do when they are said at exactly the right moment. He said, I used to hike to get away from things. Now, I hike to get toward things. Toward knowing something about the world that I can't get any other way. That is, in the end, what the wilderness offers that nothing else can replicate. Not escape, encounter. The encounter with something larger than yourself, something that has been here longer and will be here after you, and does not need you in order to exist and be magnificent. The encounter that puts you back in your place, not diminished but correctly scaled, a human animal in a world full of other animals, all of us working out how to survive and sometimes, if we're very lucky, briefly occupying the same piece of ground in peace. A grizzly bear in a huckleberry patch at first light. A man standing still, heart hammering, hand on his bear spray, talking in a low voice to an animal that could kill him easily and has decided not to. 30 feet of undergrowth and morning mist between two creatures from the same planet, acknowledging each other's presence and then going their separate ways. That is what wildness looks like. That is what it feels like, and it is still out there, in the Cascades and the Rockies and the ranges and the valleys of the American West, waiting for the people who are willing to go find it on its terms. To take the trail, the right trail, with eyes open and maps downloaded and bear spray on their hip, and pay attention. Pay attention to the birds going quiet, to the wind dropping, to the smell of something wild and animal and absolutely alive drifting out of the dark spaces between the trees. Pay attention to the breathing. If you're still here, you already know why these stories matter. There is more where this came from. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because every week we go somewhere most people never get to, into the encounters and the landscapes and the moments where nature shows exactly what it is when we stop telling it what to be. This was one man's wrong turn. Next time, it will be something else entirely. Stay close.